The moment my daughter-in-law took the Thanksgiving plate out of my hands and told me I didn't belong at her table anymore, I realized I had spent 10 years confusing tolerance for love. Thanksgiving had always been my holiday. Even after my husband Robert passed away 7 winters earlier, I still woke before sunrise every 4th Thursday in November to make the same meal he loved. Turkey in the oven by 7. Sweet potato casserole with marshmallows. Homemade cranberry sauce with orange zest. 2 pumpkin pies cooling near the kitchen window. That morning the Carter house smelled like butter, cinnamon, and rosemary before anyone else even came downstairs. I stood in the kitchen wearing my faded burgundy cardigan, the one Michael bought me years ago when he still noticed things about me, and carefully carried the serving tray toward the dining room. Outside, snow drifted softly across the quiet Illinois street, covering the lawns and mailboxes in white. Inside, warm yellow lights reflected off the polished dining table Vanessa had spent 3 days decorating for her guests. Her guests. That was how she always described them now, even though half the people arriving were relatives from my side of the family. "Don't put that there," Vanessa snapped the second she saw me approaching the table. Her voice cut through the room so sharply that even the grandchildren stopped talking. I froze, still holding the tray with both hands. "Excuse me?" I asked quietly. Vanessa walked over in her cream-colored sweater dress, smiling politely at everyone except me. "The presentation is already finished," she said. "I told you earlier not to keep adding things." My cheeks warmed instantly. "It's just the stuffing," I whispered. "Michael always likes extra." "Michael likes a lot of things," she interrupted. "That doesn't mean we need to overcrowd the table." Around us, silverware clinked awkwardly while nobody spoke. My son stood near the fireplace holding a glass of wine, staring at the television mounted above the mantel like he suddenly found football fascinating. He didn't look at me once. I slowly lowered the tray onto the kitchen counter beside me. "Of course," I murmured. Vanessa gave me a tight smile before turning back toward her guests. "Honestly," she laughed softly, "if I let Evelyn organize this dinner, we'd still be eating like it's 1987. A few people chuckled nervously. Not because it was funny, because Americans often laugh when they feel uncomfortable and don't know what else to do. I stared at the floor tiles while the laughter faded. My chest felt hollow in that familiar way it had for years now, like someone had slowly removed all the air from my life one small insult at a time. I should have walked upstairs then. I should have quietly put on my coat and left before things became worse. But mothers spend their whole lives hoping the next family dinner will somehow be different. So I stayed. More guests arrived. Vanessa poured wine. Music played softly through hidden speakers. The house looked like something from a holiday catalog, all glowing candles and matching napkins. Yet somehow, despite living there for almost 3 years after Robert's death, I felt more invisible than ever. Then came the moment I knew I would never forgive. Vanessa stood at the head of the table holding a champagne glass. "Before we eat," she announced brightly, "I just want to say how thankful I am for a peaceful home this year." She paused dramatically before adding, "And hopefully by Christmas we'll finally have a little more space around here." Several people exchanged confused looks. I felt my stomach tighten. Vanessa smiled directly at me now. "Evelyn," she said sweetly, "Michael and I think it's time you start looking into senior apartments." The room went silent. Completely silent. Even the grandchildren stopped moving. "Vanessa," Michael muttered weakly, but she continued anyway. "You've been staying here long enough," she said. "And honestly, this arrangement just isn't healthy for us anymore." I looked at my son, waiting for him to say something. Anything. Instead, he lowered his eyes into his wine glass. That hurt more than her words ever could. "I see," I whispered. Vanessa crossed her arms gently. "We're not trying to be cruel. But this house can't move forward while you're still living in it." My fingers trembled. Slightly at my sides. I nodded once slowly because dignity was the only thing I still owned. Then I walked upstairs to my bedroom while the Thanksgiving dinner I had cooked filled the house with smells that no longer felt like home. By the time I zipped my old blue suitcase closed, the Thanksgiving dinner downstairs had already started without me. I could hear forks scraping plates and glasses clinking faintly through the floor while I stood in the small guest bedroom that used to belong to my grandson before Vanessa turned it into Evelyn's room. Funny how quickly a home changes once people stop wanting you in it. I folded my cardigan carefully and placed it beside my slippers, trying to keep my hands steady. The hardest part was not the humiliation. At my age, humiliation settles quietly into your bones after enough years. The hardest part was realizing my son had not followed me upstairs. Not once. Not even to ask if I was all right. I glanced toward the framed photo beside the lamp. Robert and I at Navy Pier 30 years earlier, both sunburned and smiling into the Chicago wind. He used to tell me that no matter what happened, family should feel like shelter. Standing there alone while laughter drifted up from downstairs, I realized shelter can disappear while you are still living inside it. I carried my suitcase slowly down the staircase, one hand gripping the railing for balance. The dining room glowed with candlelight as everyone ate the meal I had spent 12 hours preparing. Nobody noticed me at first. Vanessa was in the middle of telling some story about a yoga retreat in Arizona. Michael laughed softly beside her. Then my grandson Tyler looked up. "Grandma," he said quietly. The room fell silent again. I forced a smile. "I am heading out for a little while," I said. Vanessa dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin before speaking. "Actually, Evelyn, we already looked up a few places nearby that offer monthly rentals for seniors." Her tone sounded cheerful, almost helpful, like she was discussing weather instead of removing someone from their home on Thanksgiving. I nodded once. "Thank you," I whispered. Michael finally stood up halfway from his chair. For one tiny second, hope flickered in my chest. Maybe he would stop me. Maybe he would remember who sat beside hospital beds when he had pneumonia at 8 years old. Maybe he would remember who worked double shifts after Robert lost his factory job. But instead, he reached into his wallet and awkwardly pulled out 2 $20 bills. "Mom," he muttered, unable to meet my eyes. "This should help until you figure things out." $40. After a lifetime of motherhood, my value had somehow become $40 and an uncomfortable apology. I looked at the money in his hand but did not take it. "Keep it," I said softly. Then I walked out the front door before anyone could see the tears filling my eyes. The cold November air hit my face immediately. Snow crunched beneath my shoes as I rolled my suitcase down the driveway. Behind me, the warm windows of the house glowed golden against the dark Illinois evening. For a moment I stopped at the sidewalk and looked back. I kept thinking Michael might run outside. That he might call after me the way he used to when he was little and afraid I would leave him somewhere. But the front door never opened. Cars lined the street from all the Thanksgiving guests who had witnessed my humiliation and stayed for pie anyway. I pulled my coat tighter and started walking toward the bus stop 3 blocks away. My Social Security check was still 6 days from arriving, and the only money I had left was the $50 hidden inside my old leather wallet. Enough for one cheap motel room if I was careful. The city felt strangely empty that night. Most families were inside eating turkey and watching football together while I sat alone on a freezing bus bench with one suitcase beside me. Nearly 40 minutes later, the downtown station finally came into view through the falling snow. The building smelled like burnt coffee, wet pavement and exhaustion. Travelers shuffled through carrying bags and winter coats, while an exhausted cashier repeated departure times over the loudspeaker. I found an empty seat near the vending machines and rubbed my aching hands together for warmth. That was when I noticed the teenage boy near the ticket counter. He could not have been older than 14. Blonde hair, thin jacket, nervous eyes scanning the room while the employee behind the counter grew visibly irritated. "Kid, I cannot understand you," the man snapped loudly. The boy tried again, using shaky hand gestures while holding several crumpled dollar bills. People nearby stared impatiently before looking away. And in that exact moment, sitting there with nowhere left to go myself, I saw something painfully familiar in the boy's face. The look of someone standing in a crowded room while feeling completely abandoned. The station employee sighed loudly and pushed the stack of crumpled bills back across the counter toward the boy. "Listen, kid, if you cannot explain where you are trying to go, I cannot sell you a ticket," he said impatiently. The boy's hands trembled as he tried signing again, his breathing becoming faster with every confused stare around him. People shifted awkwardly in line behind him. One woman muttered under her breath about missing her bus. Another man rolled his eyes and checked his watch dramatically. The boy looked overwhelmed, trapped inside a conversation nobody around him was willing to understand. Something inside me tightened painfully. Maybe because just an hour earlier, I had stood in a crowded dining room full of family and felt just as voiceless. I slowly stood from my seat, my knees aching from the cold, and walked toward the counter. "Excuse me," I said gently to the employee. "I think he may be deaf." The employee rubbed his forehead. "Well, I do not speak sign language." The boy looked at me cautiously, his blue eyes red from embarrassment. I offered him the softest smile I could manage. "It is okay, sweetheart," I said slowly, speaking clearly so he could read my lips if he needed to. "Do you have something written down?" For a moment he stared at me in surprise, almost like he was not used to adults speaking kindly to him. Then he quickly dug through his backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper. On it, written in uneven handwriting, was an address in Springfield, Illinois, along with the words, "Please help me get home." My heart cracked a little. Reading it, the employee glanced at the paper. "Last bus left 30 minutes ago," he said flatly. "Next one leaves at 6 tomorrow morning." The boy's shoulders sank instantly. "How much is the ticket?" I asked. The man typed something into his computer. $47. I froze. Inside my wallet sat exactly $50. $50 between me and sleeping outside in late November weather. $50 between me and the cheapest motel room I could find. My fingers tightened around the worn leather wallet inside my coat pocket. Common sense told me to sit back down, to protect myself for once, to stop rescuing people when nobody had rescued me. But then the boy looked down at the floor with that same defeated expression I had seen in my own bathroom mirror after Robert's funeral. The expression people wear when they realize they are completely alone. Before I could stop myself, I opened my wallet and pulled out the bills. "I will pay for his ticket," I said quietly. The employee blinked at me. "Ma'am, are you sure?" No, I was not sure. Not even a little. But loneliness recognizes loneliness faster than anything else in this world. "Yes," I answered anyway. The employee processed the ticket while the boy stared at me in complete shock. When I handed over the last of my money, I felt strangely calm. Not happy. Not heroic. Just calm. Like maybe kindness was the only thing nobody could take away from me anymore. The printer spat out the ticket moments later. I picked it up carefully and turned toward the boy. His eyes filled instantly with tears. "You are going home tomorrow," I told him softly, pointing toward the ticket so he understood. His lower lip trembled. Then with shaky hands, he signed something I did not understand before suddenly stepping forward and hugging me tightly around the shoulders. I had not been hugged all day. Not by my son. Not by my grandchildren. Not by anyone. I slowly wrapped my arms around the boy and closed my eyes for one brief second. He smelled like winter air and laundry detergent. Like somebody's child. When he stepped back, he quickly wiped his face and reached into his backpack again. This time he pulled out a black marker and scribbled something onto the back of an old receipt before handing it to me. The handwriting was messy but readable. "You remind me of my grandma." I stared at the words longer than I probably should have. My throat tightened painfully. "Thank you," I whispered. The loudspeaker above us crackled with another boarding announcement, while snow continued falling outside the station windows. I glanced toward the motel listings hanging beside the information desk and quietly realized I no longer had enough money for even the cheapest room. For a few seconds fear crept into my chest. Real fear. The kind people my age are too proud to admit. But somehow, standing there beside that grateful little boy, the fear did not feel as heavy anymore. Because for the first time that entire terrible day, someone had looked at me like I still mattered. The station slowly emptied as midnight approached. Families reunited near the exits while travelers dragged heavy suitcases toward late buses and waiting taxis. Meanwhile, I sat alone on a hard plastic chair beside my old blue suitcase, trying not to think too far ahead. The boy, Noah, remained nearby clutching his bus ticket carefully like it was something fragile and precious. Every few minutes he glanced toward me with uncertain eyes, almost worried I might disappear before morning. I offered him small reassuring smiles whenever he looked over. Eventually he pulled a granola bar from his backpack and shyly handed it to me. I almost laughed at the irony of it. A 14-year-old child with almost nothing still trying to share his food with an elderly stranger who had just bought his ticket home. "Thank you," I mouthed slowly so he could understand. He nodded once before sitting back down quietly. Around 1 in the morning, the station lights dimmed slightly. A tired janitor pushed a mop bucket across the floor while Christmas music played softly through distant speakers. I leaned back against the cold wall and wrapped my coat tighter around myself. The truth was beginning to settle in now. I had nowhere to sleep. At 68 years old, after decades of marriage, motherhood, church potlucks, scraped knees, packed lunches, and bedtime stories, I had become a woman sitting overnight in a bus station with one suitcase and no home to return to. Strange how life can shrink so quickly. I reached into my purse and found the folded receipt Noah had written on earlier. "You remind me of my grandma." I traced the words gently with my thumb. For some reason, that little sentence hurt more than Vanessa's insults ever could, because it reminded me there was still kindness left in the world. And kindness, once you have been starved of it long enough, becomes almost unbearable to receive. My phone buzzed suddenly in my coat pocket. "Michael." For one foolish second my heart jumped. I answered immediately. "Mom," he said quietly. I could hear dishes clattering faintly behind him. "Did you find somewhere to stay?" "Not are you okay?" "Not I am sorry. Just logistics." Like I was a scheduling inconvenience he needed resolved before bedtime. "Not yet," I answered calmly. Silence stretched between us. Then he sighed heavily. "Vanessa thinks it would be better if we all had some space for a while." I closed my eyes slowly. Even now, he still spoke through her opinions instead of his own. "I understand," I whispered. "You do not have to make this harder than it already is." He sounded tired more than guilty. That realization settled painfully inside my chest. "Michael," I said softly, "do you remember the winter you broke your arm sledding?" He hesitated. "What?" "You were 9 years old. Your father worked nights back then, so I slept upright in that hospital chair for 3 nights because you were scared to wake up alone." Silence again. "I remember," he muttered. "I would have stayed there forever if you needed me to." My voice remained calm, but tears burned quietly behind my eyes now. A mother never stops showing up for her child. On the other end of the line, I heard Vanessa calling his name impatiently from somewhere in the house. "Michael, are you coming?" she shouted faintly. He lowered his voice immediately. "Mom, I will call you tomorrow, okay?" Then the line disconnected. Just like that. No goodbye. I stared down at the dark phone screen for several seconds before slipping it back into my purse. Across from me, Noah had been watching carefully. He probably could not hear the conversation, but he recognized sadness well enough. Slowly, he stood and walked over before sitting beside me. Then he opened his backpack again and removed a small notebook. He wrote something quickly before turning it toward me. "Family should not make you feel alone." The words hit me harder than I expected. I swallowed carefully and nodded once. "You are very wise for 14, I said gently. Noah smiled faintly. Outside the station windows, snow continued falling beneath the streetlights, covering sidewalks and parked cars in silver white. Everything looked quieter now, softer somehow. Exhaustion finally settled into my bones. I rested my head against the wall and closed my eyes for a moment while Noah sat nearby drawing absent-minded circles on his notebook. Somewhere deep inside me, beneath all the humiliation and grief and disappointment, something unfamiliar began taking shape. Not anger, not revenge, something steadier. The quiet understanding that maybe losing that house did not mean losing myself. Because for years I had spent my life begging for scraps of love from people who treated my kindness like obligation. And sitting there in a freezing bus station beside a lonely deaf teenager, I suddenly realized something that changed me forever. The people who deserve your heart are usually the ones who notice it when it is breaking. Morning arrived slowly through the frosted station windows. Pale sunlight reflected off dirty snowbanks outside while weary travelers stretched across plastic chairs and checked departure boards overhead. My neck ached from sleeping upright against the wall, and my hands felt stiff from the cold. Beside me, Noah was still asleep, curled awkwardly against his backpack with his ticket clutched tightly in one hand like he was afraid someone might take it away. For a moment I simply watched him breathe. He looked younger while sleeping, smaller somehow. Like the frightened little boy, he probably still was underneath all that forced independence. I quietly removed my scarf and draped it over his shoulders. A few minutes later, the Loudspeaker announced boarding for Springfield. Noah startled awake immediately, blinking in confusion before noticing the scarf around him. When he looked up at me, his expression softened. I smiled gently and pointed toward the boarding gate. "It is time," I mouthed clearly. He nodded slowly but did not stand right away. Instead, he reached into his backpack once more and pulled out a folded photograph. In it was an older woman with silver hair standing beside him near a fishing dock somewhere during summer. Both of them smiled widely at the camera. Noah pointed to the woman, then lowered his eyes sadly. "Your grandmother?" I asked softly. He nodded. Then he made a small motion with his hand near his chest before looking down. Gone. The understanding hit me immediately. "I am so sorry," I whispered. Noah swallowed hard and carefully placed the photo back into his bag. Grief recognizes grief without needing words. When the final boarding call echoed through the station, he suddenly stepped forward and hugged me again. This time he held on longer. I closed my eyes and hugged him back gently, feeling something inside me crack open in a way I had not allowed for years. Not sadness, not pity, something warmer. Like maybe my ability to care for people had survived despite everything. Before pulling away, Noah quickly scribbled something inside his notebook and handed me the page. "Thank you for seeing me." I stared at the sentence quietly while emotion tightened my throat again. Nobody had thanked me for seeing them in a very long time. After Noah boarded the bus, I remained standing near the window watching until it disappeared into the snowy Chicago morning. Then the silence returned. Heavy, real. The kind that settles around you after the last familiar face leaves. I looked down at my nearly empty purse and finally allowed myself to face reality. I still had nowhere to go. My Social Security payment would not arrive for nearly a week, and pride could only keep a woman warm for so long in late November. I walked slowly toward the station restroom and stared at my reflection beneath the fluorescent lights. My gray hair had fallen loose during the night. Dark circles shadowed my eyes. I looked tired, older than 68. For the first time in years, I admitted something painful to myself. I had spent too much of my life trying to earn love from people who only valued what I could do for them. Cook the meals, watch the children, stay quiet, be useful. The second I became inconvenient, they pushed me aside like old furniture. A small laugh escaped me then. Not because anything was funny, but because the truth finally sounded ridiculous once spoken aloud in my own head. I washed my face with cold water and straightened my cardigan. Then I walked back into the station trying to decide what to do next. That was when I noticed the black SUV parked outside the entrance. Expensive. Immaculate. The kind of vehicle people in my neighborhood usually only saw in advertisements during football games. A tall man stepped out wearing a dark wool coat and leather gloves. He looked around the station quickly before his eyes landed directly on me. Something about the intensity of his expression made me uneasy at first. He walked toward me with calm, purposeful steps until stopping a few feet away. "Mrs. Evelyn Carter?" he asked politely. I blinked in confusion. "Yes." The man exhaled slowly, almost relieved. "My name is Daniel Bennett," he said. "I believe you helped my son last night." My heart skipped instantly. "Noah." He nodded once. He told me everything. For a brief moment I did not know what to say. Daniel looked exhausted, like someone who had driven through the night without stopping. Snowflakes melted against the shoulders of his expensive coat while he studied me carefully, almost trying to understand why a stranger would help his child at the cost of her own comfort. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently, "I think you and I need to have breakfast." Daniel Bennett drove me to a quiet diner just outside downtown Chicago where the coffee was strong, and the booth smelled faintly like maple syrup and old leather. The kind of place where truck drivers ate breakfast before sunrise, and nobody asked too many personal questions. Snow drifted softly outside the windows while waitresses moved between tables refilling coffee cups. I sat across from Daniel, still holding my purse tightly in my lap, unsure why a man who clearly belonged to another world had come looking for me. He removed his gloves carefully and studied me for a moment before speaking. "Noah has not stopped talking about you since I picked him up this morning," he said. Then he smiled faintly. "Well, as much as Noah can talk." I returned a small smile of my own. "He is a wonderful boy." Daniel nodded slowly, but there was sadness behind his eyes. He has had a difficult year. He glanced toward the snowy street outside before continuing. My mother passed away 8 months ago. She practically raised him while I worked. I immediately thought of the photograph Noah had shown me. Suddenly everything made sense. The loneliness in his eyes, the fear of being forgotten. Daniel folded his hands together on the table. The station manager called me last night after Noah finally reached me through text messages, he explained. He told me an older woman spent her last money helping my son get home safely. Heat rushed to my cheeks instantly. It was nothing, I said quietly. Daniel looked at me carefully. Most people would not call $50 nothing when they clearly needed it themselves. I lowered my eyes toward the untouched coffee in front of me. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Then Daniel said something that caught me completely off guard. Noah said you looked sad too. My throat tightened slightly. Children always notice more than adults think they do. Even children carrying their own grief. The waitress arrived with eggs, toast, and pancakes neither of us had ordered yet. Daniel must have asked while I was distracted. You need a real breakfast, he said simply. I had not eaten since Thanksgiving morning. The smell alone nearly made me emotional. I tried to hide how hungry I was while carefully buttering a piece of toast. Across the table, Daniel watched me with quiet concern but did not make me feel embarrassed about it. That alone felt strangely comforting. Eventually he leaned back slightly and asked the question I had been dreading. Mrs. Carter, he said gently, why were you at that station alone on Thanksgiving night? I stared down at my coffee cup for several long seconds. The truth felt humiliating spoken aloud. But something about Daniel's calm presence made dishonesty seem unnecessary. My son and daughter-in-law asked me to leave their home, I admitted softly. On Thanksgiving. Daniel's expression darkened immediately. They threw you out? They preferred to call it creating space, I answered with a tired little smile. He shook his head slowly like he could not understand how anyone could treat their mother that way. Truthfully, neither could I anymore. Do you have somewhere safe to stay? He asked. I hesitated before answering honestly. Not really. Daniel was quiet after that. He looked out the diner window while lightly tapping one finger against the ceramic coffee mug and thought. Finally he turned back toward me. I run a literacy foundation in Chicago, he said. We work closely with children who are deaf or hard of hearing. I listened quietly, unsure where the conversation was leading. Noah told me something else this morning, Daniel continued. He said you were the first person at that station who actually tried to understand him instead of rushing him. Emotion flickered briefly across Daniel's face before he continued speaking. My mother used to volunteer reading to children before her health declined. Since she passed, I have been trying to rebuild that program. I blinked in surprise. That sounds wonderful. Daniel leaned forward slightly now. Would you consider helping us? I stared at him in complete disbelief. Helping? Part-time to start, he clarified gently. Reading support. Community outreach. Nothing overwhelming. Then he added quietly, and before you refuse out of pride, it would come with a salary and temporary housing assistance. For a moment I could not speak at all. Less than 12 hours earlier I had been sitting alone in a freezing station believing my life was effectively over. And now a stranger was offering me dignity instead of pity. Outside, snow continued falling softly across the city, while something unfamiliar slowly unfolded inside my chest. Hope. For several seconds I simply stared at Daniel across the diner table, convinced I had misunderstood him. Opportunities like that did not appear in the lives of women like me. Not at 68 years old. Not after being discarded by your own family less than a day earlier. I do not know what to say, I admitted quietly. Daniel gave me a small understanding smile. You do not have to decide immediately. But deep down I already knew something had shifted. Not because of the job itself. Because for the first time in years someone was speaking to me like I still had value beyond what I could cook, clean, or sacrifice. Daniel drove me later that morning to a small furnished apartment owned by the foundation. It sat above a bookstore in a quiet neighborhood near Lincoln Park, with snow-covered sidewalks and little coffee shops glowing warmly against the cold Chicago afternoon. The apartment itself was simple. One bedroom. cream-colored walls, a tiny kitchen with old cabinets and a narrow window overlooking the street below. But the moment I stepped inside, emotion caught me off guard. Nobody was yelling at me there. Nobody was making me feel unwanted. The silence felt peaceful instead of lonely. Daniel placed a small envelope on the kitchen counter. "This should help you settle in for now," he said gently. I immediately shook my head. "I cannot accept charity." "Good," he answered calmly. "Because it is not charity. It is an advance." Then he added something that stayed with me long afterward. "Mrs. Carter, sometimes accepting help is how we survive long enough to help others later." After he left, I stood alone in the apartment for a long time with my coat still on, simply trying to process how dramatically life could change in 24 hours. The previous evening I had been silently humiliated at my own Thanksgiving table. Now I was holding keys to a place that was entirely mine. Small, temporary, imperfect, but mine. I unpacked slowly that afternoon, placing Robert's photograph beside the bed, and neatly folding my few sweaters into dresser drawers that smelled faintly like cedar wood. At sunset, snowflakes drifted lazily past the window while Christmas lights flickered on across the street. I heated canned soup on the stove and ate quietly at the tiny kitchen table. For the first time in years, I did not feel nervous sitting in silence. Back at Michael's house, silence had always meant tension. Vanessa upset about something, Michael avoiding conflict, everyone pretending not to notice the growing discomfort beneath the surface. But here silence simply meant peace. The next morning, Daniel picked me up early and brought me to the Bennett Literacy Foundation downtown. The building overlooked the Chicago River, all glass windows and polished marble floors. I nearly turned around twice before reaching the entrance because I felt terribly out of place. Women my age are often made to feel invisible in modern spaces unless they are wealthy or glamorous. I was neither. But the moment I stepped inside, Noah came running down the hallway toward me with the brightest smile I had seen yet. He signed something excitedly to Daniel before hugging me tightly. I laughed softly in surprise. "I guess that means he is happy to see you," Daniel translated with amusement. Soon I met the children's reading group. Some were deaf. Some struggled with speech. Some simply came from difficult homes where nobody had time to read with them after school. Yet every child looked at me with curiosity instead of judgment. One little girl with pink glasses climbed directly into the chair beside mine during story hour and leaned against my arm halfway through the book like she had known me forever. Something inside me softened completely then. I had spent years believing my life was slowly ending after Robert died. But sitting there surrounded by children listening carefully as I turned pages and spoke slowly enough for them to follow my lips, I suddenly felt useful again. Needed again. Alive again. Meanwhile, nearly 20 miles away in the expensive suburban house where I once lived, cracks had already begun forming beneath Vanessa's perfect image. That evening Michael discovered unopened credit card statements hidden inside a kitchen drawer showing thousands of dollars in unpaid debt. Bills he knew nothing about. Charges for luxury shopping trips and expensive weekends Vanessa had claimed were business networking. For the first time in years, my son finally started asking questions. And for the first time in years, Vanessa no longer had complete control over the answers. The first week at the Bennett Literacy Foundation passed in a quiet rhythm I had almost forgotten existed. Each morning I woke up in the small apartment above the bookstore, made tea in a simple ceramic mug, and walked through streets that no longer carried the weight of memories I could not escape. The city felt different when you were no longer trying to survive inside someone else's approval. At the foundation, the children greeted me with growing familiarity. Noah often arrived early with his father, Daniel Bennett, and every time he saw me he would wave with both hands before running over as if afraid I might disappear again. I began to understand his world more each day, learning simple signs Daniel taught me during breaks, so I could communicate with him more naturally. There was something deeply healing about that quiet effort, about trying to understand someone without needing them to speak aloud. Meanwhile, I noticed changes in Daniel as well. He was still a busy man, always checking his phone between meetings and coordinating programs across the city, but when he spoke to the children he softened in a way that reminded me of someone who had not allowed himself to breathe properly in a long time. One afternoon, after reading a story about a lost puppy who finds its way home, I sat with Noah in the corner of the classroom while the other children played nearby. He leaned against the table and drew something on a piece of paper before showing it to me. It was a simple drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands under a sun. He pointed at himself, then at me, then at Daniel. Then he smiled. I felt something warm rise in my chest that I had not experienced in years. Not happiness exactly. Something closer to belonging. At the same time, I was slowly becoming aware that life outside my small circle was shifting in ways I had not expected. Daniel mentioned during one of our morning drives that attendance at the foundation programs had increased significantly since a small article about Noah's story and my involvement had been shared online. Apparently, a woman who gave away her last $50 to help a child she had just met was something people found meaningful. I had not known about any article until he told me, and I felt embarrassed at first, but Daniel assured me it was being received in a positive way. People need reminders that kindness still exists, he said simply while driving across the river. But back in the suburbs, kindness was not what Vanessa was experiencing. Michael had started asking questions she could no longer easily avoid. At first, they were small questions about credit cards and unexplained charges. Then they became louder questions about bank statements and missing explanations for trips she had taken without him. Vanessa, who had always controlled conversations with charm and quick deflections, began to lose her rhythm. One evening, Michael stood in the kitchen holding a stack of printed statements. I was not there to witness it, but I would later hear about it from Daniel, whose assistant occasionally monitored financial developments involving donors connected to his foundation network. The foundation had no interest in family drama, but Daniel seemed to notice patterns when they affected people close to him. According to what I was told, Michael asked Vanessa directly why thousands of dollars had been spent on luxury purchases that had never been discussed. For the first time, she did not have an immediate answer. She laughed nervously, then claimed it was for household improvements and family obligations, but her voice apparently did not carry the same confidence it once had. Meanwhile, my days continued to fill with simple purpose. I read stories to children who had never had anyone read to them before. I helped organize books into small shelves labeled with bright colors. I learned the names of children who used to hide behind chairs but now sat closer each day. One little boy with a speech delay began calling me Miss Evelyn, in a soft, careful voice that made me smile every time I heard it. Slowly, without realizing it, I stopped counting the days since Thanksgiving. They no longer mattered the way they once did. One morning, Daniel invited me to accompany him to a donor appreciation event at the foundation's downtown headquarters. I hesitated at first, worried I would feel out of place, but he insisted gently. "You belong there as much as anyone," he said. I wore a simple navy dress I had purchased with the first small payment from my position at the foundation, and for the first time in years I looked at myself in the mirror without feeling invisible. The event took place in a glass-walled hall overlooking the Chicago River, filled with professionals, educators, and community leaders. I stood near the edge of the room at first, holding a glass of water, unsure of where to place myself. Then Noah spotted me from across the room and ran over excitedly, pulling Daniel behind him. Conversations around us softened as people began to notice who I was. Not as a forgotten mother or a discarded mother-in-law, but as the woman who had helped a child when no one else did. Later that evening, I saw Vanessa for the first time since everything had fallen apart. She arrived with Michael, dressed elegantly as always, smiling for appearances. But when her eyes landed on me standing beside Daniel and Noah, her expression faltered for just a fraction of a second. It was enough. Because in that brief moment, I realized she understood something she had never expected. I was no longer where she had left me. The morning after the donor event felt different in a way I could not immediately explain. I woke up in my small apartment above the bookstore as sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting soft lines across the wooden floor. For a moment I simply lay there, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside. It was not the kind of silence that pressed against my chest like it used to. It felt lighter, as if the air itself had learned to breathe again. When I arrived at the Bennett Literacy Foundation that day, the atmosphere inside the building was unusually busy. Staff members moved quickly through the hallways, speaking in low voices, checking phones, and glancing toward the conference room where Daniel Bennett was already holding an early morning meeting. Noah ran to me first, as always, his face bright with excitement, but I noticed something different in the way people looked at me now. There was recognition. Not of fame but of story. The kind of recognition that comes when strangers decide your life means something beyond your own experience. Daniel called me into his office later that morning. The room overlooked the Chicago River, sunlight reflecting off the water in soft waves. He gestured for me to sit, then placed a folder on the desk between us. "There is something I think you should know," he said calmly. Inside the folder was a printed article. My name was in the headline. So was Noah's. It described the night at the station, the $50, and the bus ticket that changed everything. I stared at the words in silence, my hands tightening slightly around the edge of the paper. "I did not authorize this," Daniel added quickly, noticing my expression. "But I also did not stop it. Because I think your story matters." I felt heat rise in my chest. Not anger exactly. More like vulnerability being exposed to light. "I am not used to people reading about my life," I admitted quietly. Daniel nodded. "Most people are not. But sometimes truth travels faster than we expect." Later that afternoon, while I was helping children organize books in the reading room, I noticed a few visitors pointing discreetly toward me through the glass. One of the teachers whispered something about a local news segment. I smiled politely at the children, but inside I felt strangely unsettled. I had never done anything to be seen. I had only done what felt human. That evening Daniel offered to drive me home, but I asked him to drop me near the river instead. I needed to walk. The air was cold but not uncomfortable. Chicago in early winter has a way of making everything feel more honest. I stood by the water for a long time, watching the city lights reflect on the surface like broken pieces of gold. For the first time I thought about Robert without pain. I thought about how he used to say that a person's value was not measured by how much they were needed, but by how much they were respected when they were no longer convenient. Back at the suburban house across town, things were falling apart in quieter ways. Michael had finally confronted Vanessa with evidence from the financial records. The foundation's outreach coordinator had mentioned it to Daniel, and Daniel, in turn, had made sure certain concerns were properly documented. There were no accusations from me, no involvement from me, only facts that could no longer be hidden behind charm or distraction. Vanessa, once so confident in controlling every conversation, was now being forced to answer questions she had avoided for months. Meanwhile, Michael was beginning to see the full picture of the distance that had grown between who he was and what he had allowed. I was not there to witness their arguments, but I was told later that silence, for the first time, had become uncomfortable inside that house. At the foundation, my life continued in a rhythm that slowly felt like healing. The children no longer hesitated when they saw me. They ran toward me, asked questions, and leaned in closer during story time. Noah had begun teaching me more signs, correcting me gently when I made mistakes, laughing when I accidentally signed something incorrectly. It became our small shared language, something built not from words but from patience. One afternoon, after a reading session, Noah handed me a drawing again. This time it showed a house with a small garden, a river behind it, and 3 figures standing together. Underneath he had written in careful letters, "This is family." I stared at it longer than I expected to, feeling something steady and grounding settle inside me. Not longing for what I lost, but recognition of what I had found in its place. Weeks passed, then months. The article continued circulating quietly online, shared by people who said it reminded them of their own mothers, grandmothers, and neighbors they had stopped noticing. Daniel never asked me to speak publicly, but he did occasionally mention that donations to the foundation had increased. People wanted to be part of something that felt real. One winter evening, as snow began falling again over Chicago, I stood outside the foundation building watching children leave with their parents. Noah came running out last, pulling Daniel behind him. He stopped in front of me and hugged me tightly, as he always did. Then he signed something quickly before Daniel translated softly. "He says thank you for not walking away from him." I smiled, brushing snowflakes from his hair. "I think he saved me too," I said quietly. That night, as I walked home alone through the softly falling snow, I realized something I had never fully understood before. Losing a family does not always mean losing love. Sometimes it means finally learning the difference between being needed and being valued. And for the first time in a very long life, I was no longer